All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of The Outlander here on hearthfireradio.com. Just want to say a couple of things preliminarily before we get into the topic at hand. First of all, for those who are not familiar, Hearthfire Radio is a platform that we started in September of 2024 that contains... It's a home for dissident voices, for pagan voices, for people who celebrate the traditional folkways and religions of European peoples. And The Outlander is my show on Hearthfire Radio, where I just basically monologue at you for a few minutes and give you my takes and thoughts on the topics at hand, basically expanding on ideas that I flesh out, whether it's in the Culture Thug Handbook or in the Substack or elsewhere. So for those of you who are not familiar, that's what's going on here right now. And I figured that this would be a good forum for me to address some controversy that's recently come up over a book that we published, that Imperium Press published, The Shaman of the Radical Right, which is the biography of Jonathan Bowden. As many of you know, it's absolutely rocketed up the sales charts, and lots of people are reading it, and lots of people are digging into it and finding out who this guy really was. And it's actually courted a little bit of controversy because there are many people who feel that we have demythologized Jonathan Bowden, and that maybe it was a disservice to him to publish this biography. Now, I have some thoughts on that. We're going to share that with you, but I figured that The Outlander was a good forum for this because we'll get into some deeper topics about folkhood and myth and the mythic framing of reality. So in any case, I will just say before I defend our publishing of this book that I actually really do understand the criticism. I get it, right? Nobody understands disenchantment better than us here at Imperium Press. Nobody understands what it is for something to be a myth and the power of myth than we do here at Imperium Press. We are, after all, the publisher of Georges Sorel, whose Reflections on Violence basically sets out the not the classic definition, but the superior working definition of what a myth means in modern times, right? We're the ones who speak at length on the axial age and the problems that bringing disenchantment into the world, over rationalization. We're the ones that are essentially the foremost exponents of why that's a problem, how it can be rolled back, and essentially a critique of disenchantment. So I understand. I very, very much understand why people are upset about this. I read the book before almost anyone, obviously before it came out, and before pretty much anybody who, except for the proofreaders, had read it. And my thoughts on this, I thought it was actually an exhilarating read, and that it was something quite interesting. It was like looking through a dark glass at the radical right in a time of innocence, in a time and place which was, you could say, even more hostile to it than the current regime. I know that's, itself controversial to say because, the whole crackdown of the UK and, totalitarianism and anarcho-tyranny and all of that stuff, of course, yes. But just imagine what it would be like to be a dissident in, mid-2000s Britain for a moment. This was a time and place that was essentially not just hostile to, but utterly indifferent to radical right-wing ideas. The men who were doing this at that time were made of some pretty stern stuff. This is, they are to be commended. They are heroes. They're what you might call patriots. They're impressive. They're impressive figures, and Jonathan Bowden was perhaps the most impressive of them in some ways. And the biography is a little bit painful. Yes, of course it is, because it is a unflinching look at what the man actually was. Sorry if the camera's getting a little shaky here. It's super windy today. Yes, it's very, very painful. Jonathan Bowden was an amazing person, but he was also a flawed man. He was a genius, and geniuses are often flawed in just this way. But I have to ask myself, why read a biography about someone unless you want to find out who they are? This is not a eulogy. This is we printed a eulogy to him in our edition of Why I Am Not a Liberal, which was one of the first books that we put out. We respect Bowden so much. I think he was number 4 in our published books. So it's not that Imperium doesn't respect Jonathan Bowden. Reading this book, I thought many times about what it would be like if somebody wrote a similar biography on me. Because it is, there's a lot of embarrassing information in there. I mean, just to get to know who this guy is requires you basically to, you're uncovering some very painful truths about who he was. But ultimately, I wouldn't mind this book being written about me because, I have nothing to hide, right? But still, it's very revealing. It's very unbuttoning. That's why we put the picture of him on the cover, where you could his shirt's a little bit unbuttoned, right? It makes sense. It is very revealing. So I get it. I absolutely get it. The criticism is not falling on deaf ears. It's, point taken, absolutely. But there's more to say on this.
What our people are crying out for isn't really a religion or a belief system. It's a form of mental strengthening in and of themselves to overcome the disprivileging mechanisms that don't allow them to think, and also allow them to reconnect with core areas of identity.
The fact is that we, and by we I mean the folkish right, dissident politics, the radical right, what have you, basically everybody that stands outside of the mainstream, who is not contributing to the downfall of the West, the downfall of our countries, and the erasure of our folkhoods, everybody in that milieu, shall we say, we must write our own histories. Because if we don't, they will, right? We can't leave it to The Spectator or Jacobin magazine to tell you who Jonathan Bowden really was, right? There was an article in The Independent, I think it was about 2019, where somebody, it's written about in Dutton's book, but where somebody basically tells you about his journey into the radical right and getting red pilled by Jonathan Bowden, and then his exit from the radical right, being de-radicalized through whatever means. If we don't write our own histories, this is what the history of Jonathan Bowden, this is what the mainstream understanding of Jonathan Bowden will be like, if there is any mainstream understanding of Jonathan Bowden. So it's so important for us, and it goes to a much deeper question of what it is to be a folk. And what it is to be a folk is essentially to be a self-contained unit, to not accept their narratives about who we are, to not accept their histories, to not accept basically any sort of epistemic framing outside of our own. We must have our own framework. As my co-host on Newark Roundtable, Brunwolf, so eloquently says, Yggdrasil must be planted in our soil. The world tree must be planted where we are. We are not a footnote in somebody else's story, right? We have to write our own histories. We have to take control of our own narratives, because if we don't, our enemies will. And that's what's been happening. And this is what the radical right has ultimately been doing for generations now, is trying to reframe history and reality and our understanding of the world according to ourselves and not according to somebody else's worldview.
Now, my view is the following. I'm technically a pagan. And pagans believe that creation and destruction go together. That love is fury. That whatever occurred and whatever occurs, we don't have to apologize. We step over what exists.
But I mean, to some extent, what I've just said about taking control of our own narratives, as true as it is, in some ways leaves the question of why did we publish such a revealing biography untouched? Why did we publish something that is disenchanting in some way of the Bowden mythos? And it's here, I think, that we have to go into what the effect has been, basically, of this publication. And the effect has been that since it's been published, Shaman of the Radical Right has been written about in The Spectator, a mainstream British magazine, by one of their associate editors, no less, who gave his reminiscences of Bowden, and who was quite respectful about it. It was also written about by the Jacobin mag, or Jacobin magazine, however it's phrased, who was much less, they were much more harsh and hostile towards Jonathan Bowden than Damian Thompson in The Spectator was. But nobody reads them. So who cares? Their readership is now basically minorities, cat ladies, and freaks of all kinds. Really what the Jacobins' real readership now is, because, the people that they try to defend are basically illiterate. Their real readership is people like the Lincoln Project, you know what I'm talking about, the anti-Trumpers, the center right that's really up in arms about the populist revolution and all this stuff. That is who reads Jacobin magazine. And you know what? Those people have all had Jonathan Bowden, who they had no idea about, no idea. They have had him thrust in front of their view for the first time ever. So what's happened, the result, the effect of publishing this book, because it has been so revealing of this figure, has been essentially to put him in front of a mass audience for the first time, maybe ever. Ed Dutton himself says in one of his videos that he's recently posted that that the Spectator contacted him and basically said, look, we're going to run a piece. It's going to have some disparaging remarks, but it's par for the course. We kind of have to do that. The impression that one gets is that these people actually, at least in the more respectable UK magazines, are not completely against us, and that have at least some sympathies, but are simply, their hands are tied and they're unable to express those sympathies in public. I know this from running Imperium Press and being aware of who reads us. So the fact is that now what you might call normies, if not the sort of mouth-breathing normies, then at least the people who read these kind of magazines, who are still firmly within the Overton window, but they're people who think a little bit harder than your average person who watches Netflix or whatever. These people are now paying attention. Normies of that stripe are paying attention. When Imperium Press publishes a book, mainstream news outlets pay attention and they write about it. So in publishing this book, this was our way of essentially getting Bowden, giving him a bit of a boost in terms of his mainstream footprint.
always have to understand that individual white Americans have absolutely no control over their elites, just as we have no control over ours, because they've gone to a global level and they think they've left us behind. They think England and Britain's a puddle and they can step out of it to universality. Well, you can't step out of it to universality, because if you're not rooted in something, you don't come from anywhere. There are no roots that go down into the earth, and you can be moved about like a weed which has very weak roots and just ripped out. And somebody stronger will rip you out.
Now, I think there's also another element to the criticism that's worth addressing, which is that we have now ruined the Bowden mythos. I replied in a tweet on X or Twitter, whatever. I replied that to a post that said exactly that the Bowden mythos has now been ruined, or, you know, that this has basically killed the magic, essentially. And in my view, I mean, I've been watching Jonathan Bowden videos since long before Imperium Press. He was an important part of my early journey into radical politics. He is not what, and I've never believed that he has ever been really a mythic figure. I don't think that. I think that that term needs to be reserved for special cases, basically. Jonathan Bowden was a disseminator and popularizer of radical right-wing ideas. He was not, you know, an Austrian painter figure. He was not a Bodhidharma. He was not a King Arthur or these kind of figures. But he was a shaman. And this is very interesting, and this is part of the interest of the book. This is really its unique framing that makes it of interest. The shaman is a figure who is not an aristocrat. He's not high status. He is not at the top of the pecking order. He is a figure who is a little bit outside of the group, outside of the folk. He has 1 foot inside the folk and 1 foot outside at once, which, if you see what some of the people in the Monday Club or in the British National Party have to say about him, this makes a lot of sense. The shaman is a figure who enters into a state of ecstasy, who communicates with the spirits of the dead, of the ancestors and the gods, is a kind of wounded healer, you could say, who is essentially somebody that's there to heal the tribe, to heal the folk, to help them in the same way, much removed, but in a similar way to what a doctor would do today. This is why shamans are often called witch doctors in the sort of colloquial sense, right? Dutton says in the book that Bowden, during a kind of trance, would commune with the based ghosts of the past, distill and then control them, and then render them present and inspirational for his audience. And that's exactly what he did. Jonathan Bowden can do much, much more to popularize radical right-wing ideas by being written about in The Spectator than he can in an internet echo chamber who loves him for what he was not, who loves him for the idea of Jonathan Bowden rather than the reality of Jonathan Bowden. So that would be my response to this controversy, which I think will in very short order be forgotten, but it's worth addressing. The fact is that we need to take control of our own narrative. The Jonathan Bowden biography frames somebody who was our guy, not as a myth, but as a shaman. And the effect of publishing this biography has been to mainstream him. And so on this count, I think that the publication of the biography has been a tremendous success. Ed Dutton deserves commendation for such amazing research and for being sympathetic to him, as people have accused him of not being. I think that's a bunch of nonsense. So with that, folks, thanks for joining me here on The Outlander. Anybody who is watching this on YouTube, please go and sign up to hearthfireradio.com. There's a huge amount of amazing podcasts and material for you to discover lying buried beneath the surface. So go on over to hearthfireradio.com, have a look at what's there and sign up. And with that, we'll see you on the next episode.